Welcome to Facts Radio, your journey through history begins here. In this episode, we explore the samurai, honor, war and tradition, diving deep into the 700-year saga of Japan's iconic warrior class, from their humble beginnings as provincial guards to their ascendance as the nation's undisputed rulers. We will uncover the true meaning of Bushido, the way of the warrior, and trace the lineage of conflict, artistry, and unwavering loyalty that forged the legend of the samurai, a legacy that continues to echo through the modern world. Chapter 1: The First Sword, Origins in the Kanto Plain. The curtain rises not on the polished marble halls of an emperor, but on the unforgiving, rugged terrain of the Kanto Plain during Japan's Heian period, the 8th through 12th centuries. This vast, fertile region, far from the sophisticated court in Kyoto, was a land of constant friction, where local landowners and minor noble families vied relentlessly for control over rice paddies and critical trade routes. The central government, insulated by ceremony and an obsession with court poetry, held authority in name only. It was here, in this vacuum of power, that the need for a new kind of warrior was desperately felt. The court nobles, effeminate and averse to the grime of combat, were increasingly incapable of protecting their provincial estates from bandits, pirates, or rival landholders. They delegated the brutal work of enforcement to men who lived and breathed the harsh realities of the frontier. These early, unofficial guards were known as saburai, a term derived from the verb saburao, meaning to serve or to wait upon. They were initially little more than armed retainers, hired muscle for the aristocracy, their social status distinctly lower than the privileged elite they protected. These proto-samurai were masters of a unique form of mounted archery, the kyudo. Unlike the later, iconic image of the swordsman, the early samurai was first and foremost a horse archer, utilizing the formidable Japanese longbow, the yumi. On the wide, flat plains, mobility was paramount, and a warrior who could deliver devastating barrages from horseback held the definitive advantage. The constant, localized warfare honed their skills into an exceptional, disciplined martial art, the foundation upon which centuries of military dominance would be built. Imagine the tension in a small, isolated village at the edge of the wilderness, where protection meant survival and weakness guaranteed ruin. These local conflicts began to coalesce into larger, dynastic struggles, particularly between the emerging warrior clans that had successfully consolidated power in the provinces. The two great clans that would eventually shatter the peace of the Heian court were the Taira and the Minamoto, both of whom claimed descent, ironically, from imperial lines that had been cast out of Kyoto and forced to make their fortunes in the countryside. The Heian court's misguided reliance on these burgeoning military powers was their undoing. They used the warrior clans as blunt instruments against one another or to crush uprisings, never anticipating the terrifying prospect of the sword turning against the silk. The court saw them as coarse brutes, necessary but ultimately disposable tools of statecraft. This underestimation provided the warrior class with the perfect opportunity to study the inner workings of power while simultaneously cultivating the military strength that would one day seize it entirely. This era was a crucible, smelting the basic retainer into a professional soldier. The name samurai gradually evolved into samurai, marking their transition from mere servants to the specialized, elite fighting force of the powerful clans. Their loyalty, though initially transactional, hardened into a fierce bond of obligation to their immediate lord, a relationship far more tangible and immediate than the distant, abstract authority of the emperor. It is this unwavering commitment to the clan leader that became the genetic code of the samurai society. It's hard to believe, but the very first iteration of the samurai was less about the philosophy of Bushido and more about practical, brutal self-interest and survival. The concepts of honor and sacrifice would soon be grafted onto this foundation of martial necessity, but the root was always the cold, hard logic of provincial warfare. The stage was set for a dramatic clash, the refined elegance of the court versus the unyielding force of the warrior. Chapter 2: The Genpei War, the sword seizes the throne. The simmering provincial tensions finally boiled over into a national cataclysm, the Genpei War, 1180 to 1185. This brutal, 5-year conflict was the first national struggle between the Taira and Minamoto clans, fundamentally transforming the political landscape of Japan forever. The Taira, under the leadership of Taira no Kiyomori, had, for a time, successfully infiltrated the imperial court, intermarrying with the royal family and occupying key ministerial posts. They were masters of the sea, but their corruption and arrogance bred resentment among the other clans, most notably the exiled Minamoto. The war began with a series of minor skirmishes that quickly escalated into pitched battles. The Minamoto, led by the brilliant tactician Minamoto no Yoritomo and his younger, charismatic half-brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, rallied their forces in the Kanto region. The Taira, despite their initial strategic advantage and control of the capital, were weakened by internal divisions and a sense of entitled complacency. The war became a desperate struggle for the soul of Japan, fought by men who were no longer simple retainers, but commanders of armies. The battles of the Genpei War are legendary, defining the warrior ethos for centuries to come. The Battle of Dan no Yura in 1185, a massive naval engagement in the Shimonoseki Strait, marked the climactic end. Imagine the chaos, hundreds of ships locked in mortal combat, the sound of arrows tearing through the air, the desperate cries of men plunging into the sea, all under a sky heavy with the smell of blood and brine. The Taira were utterly annihilated, their 7-year-old emperor Antiko drowning alongside his grandmother. This event was not merely a military defeat, it was the symbolic end of the emperor's political power. The victory of the Minamoto clan was a watershed moment. Minamoto no Yoritomo, now the undisputed master of Japan, chose not to occupy Kyoto and become another victim of the court's seductive, debilitating luxury. Instead, he established his headquarters in Kamakura, far from the capital, a stark contrast to the opulence of the imperial city. This strategic move signaled the birth of a fundamentally new system of government, the shogunate. Yoritomo, in 1192, was formally granted the title of Sei Taishogun, or barbarian subduing great general. This title was nominally bestowed by the emperor, but in reality, it designated Yoritomo as the true military and political ruler of the nation. The emperor remained the spiritual and ceremonial head of state, a vital but powerless figurehead. Political power had irrevocably shifted from the court to the battlefield, from the refined scholar to the rugged samurai commander. The creation of the Kamakura shogunate, 1185 to 1333, institutionalized the rule of the warrior class. The samurai were no longer simply guards, they were the government, the law, and the ultimate authority. Yoritomo established the bakufu, literally tent government, a military bureaucracy that effectively controlled all aspects of national life, from land allocation to justice. Every samurai was now bound by a formal, feudal obligation to the shogun. It's hard to believe, but the Minamoto victory paradoxically sealed the fate of its own heroes. The relationship between Yoritomo and his brilliant, victorious younger brother, Yoshitsune, soured under the weight of Yoritomo's paranoia. Yoshitsune, the dashing, beloved hero of the war, was eventually hunted down and forced to commit ritual suicide. This tragic fratricide solidified a terrifying lesson: in the samurai world, loyalty to the system, to the shogun, was absolute, and even the greatest hero could be sacrificed to secure political stability. The samurai's ascent was bathed in the blood of kin. Chapter 3: Forging the Blade, the Way of the Warrior, Bushido. With the samurai now the ruling class, there was an urgent need to formalize the ethics, conduct, and philosophy that governed their lives. This necessity led to the crystallization of Bushido, the Way of the Warrior, a code that evolved over centuries but reached its definitive form during the relative peace of the Tokugawa Shogunate. Bushido was far more than a military doctrine, it was a comprehensive moral framework that elevated the samurai beyond a mere mercenary. The core tenets of Bushido were rooted in a fusion of indigenous Shinto beliefs, which stressed purity and reverence for nature, and the powerful imported philosophies of Confucianism and Zen Buddhism. Confucianism provided the rigid social structure, emphasizing the 5 relationships, particularly the absolute loyalty of the retainer to the Lord, filial piety, and benevolence. Zen Buddhism, however, offered the crucial spiritual element, discipline, focus, and a serene acceptance of death. The central pillar of Bushido was honor, or meo. This honor was not just personal pride, it was the outward manifestation of one's complete adherence to the code. A samurai's worth was measured by his honor, and to lose it was to lose everything, a fate worse than death itself. This absolute commitment to personal integrity provided the samurai with a profound sense of purpose, ensuring that their actions were always aligned with their moral and social obligations. This commitment to honor found its most dramatic expression in the ritual of seppuku, or ritual suicide by disembowelment. This wasn't merely a form of execution, it was a final, profound act of agency. By taking their own life in this agonizing manner, a samurai could redeem a failure, prove their sincere loyalty, or avoid the dishonor of capture. Imagine the serenity and terrifying resolve required to accept such a fate, a testament to the code's psychological power. The tools of the samurai, the sword, or katana, were imbued with spiritual significance. The process of forging a katana was a sacred ritual, transforming iron ore into a living weapon, an extension of the warrior's soul. The katana was a symbol of the samurai's status and virtue, an object so revered it was rarely even touched by those outside the warrior class. The dual sword practice, daisho, consisting of the long katana and the shorter wakizashi, became the unmistakable mark of the samurai. Discipline, or gyu, was paramount. Training was a lifelong pursuit, demanding rigorous practice in kenjutsu, swordsmanship, kijutsu, archery, and sojutsu, spearmanship. This discipline extended beyond the battlefield into daily life, cultivating self-control and an almost emotionless demeanor in the face of adversity. This was the practice of mushin, the no-mind state derived from Zen, allowing the warrior to act instinctively and effectively without the crippling interference of fear or doubt. It's hard to believe, but the philosophy of Bushido was not written down in its definitive form until centuries after the samurai first took power. It evolved organically, a living tradition passed from master to apprentice, father to son, shaped by the demands of war and the needs of a ruling elite. This slow, continuous evolution ensured its powerful, enduring relevance throughout the entire samurai age. Chapter 4: The Golden Age of Strife, the Warring States Period. The samurai's disciplined rule was tragically shattered in the 15th and 16th centuries. The Ashikaga shogunate, which had followed the Kamakura shogunate, gradually lost control over the provinces, leading to a century and a half of relentless, chaotic civil war known as the Sengo Jidai, the Warring States Period, 1467 to 1603. This was the samurai's truest and bloodiest test, an era of ultimate martial meritocracy where only the strongest survived. The catalyst for this widespread anarchy was the Onin War, 1467 to 1477, a decade-long conflict over the shogunal succession that utterly devastated Kyoto. The capital was reduced to ashes, and the authority of the shogun evaporated entirely. This left a power vacuum into which hundreds of ambitious, regional warlords, known as daimyo, exploded. These daimyo were the true rulers of the age, each commanding their own vast armies of samurai and fighting for control of the entire country. This period was characterized by gekkokujo, or the low overthrowing the high. A samurai's birthright became less important than his strategic cunning, ruthlessness, and ability to win battles. Talented, low-born individuals could rise quickly through the ranks of a daimyo's army, earning land and titles through sheer military prowess. The old, rigid clan structures often gave way to merit-based military command, making the battlefield a brutal but efficient testing ground for genius. The key to victory was the mobilization of large-scale armies and the construction of massive, strategically located castles. The great daimyo like Takeda Shingen and Usuji Kenshin became legends of military strategy, commanding tens of thousands of troops in battles that defined the topography of Japan. Their campaigns were not small-scale skirmishes but immense, choreographed movements of armies, where the samurai class fought for the ultimate prize, the unification of Japan. Imagine the tension within a samurai household during this period. Loyalty was perpetually tested as lords rose and fell with terrifying speed. A retainer might find himself having to switch allegiance multiple times in a lifetime, a necessary compromise to protect his family and his estate. The concept of Bushido became highly localized, focused fiercely on the immediate lord's will, sometimes at the expense of national stability. Survival dictated a flexible, often cynical approach to fidelity. The chaos of the Sengo Jidai would only be resolved by the emergence of three legendary figures, the Great Unifiers. Oda Nobunaga, the brilliant, brutal pioneer who adopted firearms and shattered traditional warfare, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the peasant who rose to command the nation through political genius, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, the patient, calculating strategist who would ultimately secure the peace. It is hard to believe that such profound order could arise from such prolonged anarchy, yet these men would harness the samurai's skill and discipline to finally forge a single, unified Japan. The samurai was poised for its final, most transformative chapter, moving from the age of constant war to the age of mandated peace. Chapter 5: The Great Unifiers, Fire, Genius, and Patience. The chaos of the Sengo Jidai demanded a new kind of warrior leader, a daimyo capable of vision that stretched beyond provincial borders. The 16th century saw the rise of the three colossal figures known as the Great Unifiers, men who were themselves samurai but who recognized that the age of constant warring had to end if Japan was to survive. The first was Oda Nobunaga, 1534 to 1582, a man of ferocious ambition and terrifying innovation, known for his relentless pursuit of military superiority and his utter disregard for tradition when it hindered his goals. Nobunaga was the first to fully harness the power of the arquebus, the matchlock firearm introduced by Portuguese traders. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, he deployed his gunners in defensive lines, utilizing volley fire tactics that systematically annihilated the charging cavalry of the legendary Takeda clan, a defining samurai force. This single battle fundamentally changed Japanese warfare, proving that discipline and technology could triumph over centuries of martial tradition. Nobunaga was ruthless, burning monasteries that housed rival armies and executing enemies without mercy, famously declaring, "If the bird does not sing, kill it." Following Nobunaga's shocking assassination by one of his own generals, the mantle of unification was seized by his most loyal and capable general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, 1537 to 1598. Born a peasant, Hideyoshi's ascent was a testament to the meritocracy of the Sengo Jidai. He lacked the noble birth of his peers, but possessed unparalleled political genius, strategic cunning, and a mastery of logistics. Where Nobunaga used fire, Hideyoshi used diplomacy, guile, and overwhelming economic power to subdue the remaining daimyo. Hideyoshi secured his power through a series of dramatic decrees. Most notably, the sword hunter of 1588 confiscated all weapons from non-samurai, peasants, farmers, and priests. This act solidified the samurai as the sole military class, ensuring that only they could bear the katana, thus freezing the rigid social hierarchy in place. He completed the unification of Japan, but his ambition spilled over into failed invasions of Korea, draining national resources and leaving a dangerous instability upon his death. The third and final unifier was Tokugawa Ieyasu, 1543 to 1616. Ieyasu was the embodiment of patience, endurance, and strategic foresight, famously saying, "If the bird does not sing, wait for it." He was a longtime ally and vassal to both Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, surviving their volatile reigns through cautious neutrality and building his own vast, secure power base in the Kanto plain, the historic birthplace of the samurai. The definitive clash came in the year 1600 at the Battle of Sekigahara. This massive engagement pitted Ieyasu's eastern forces against a coalition of western daimyo vying for control following Hideyoshi's death. Imagine the scope of the battle, two monumental armies clashing on a single plain, the outcome hanging in the balance, swayed only by Ieyasu's deep web of loyalties and last-minute defections. Ieyasu's victory was absolute, cementing his position as the supreme ruler of Japan. 3 years later, Ieyasu accepted the title of shogun, establishing the Tokugawa Shogunate, 1603 to 1868, and setting up his bakufo in the nascent city of Edo, modern Tokyo. This act ended the Sengo Jidai and ushered in a new era of profound, enforced peace that would last over 250 years. The Great Unifiers had effectively finished the job started centuries before. The samurai were now the institutionalized rulers of a nation at peace. It's hard to believe, but the ultimate success of the Great Unifiers hinged not only on their military might but on their understanding that the samurai, though bred for war, needed a new purpose. The age of ceaseless battle was over, and the warrior class now faced a greater challenge, ruling a nation without the immediate threat of annihilation. The nature of the samurai was about to undergo its most profound, peaceful, and ultimately devastating transformation. Chapter 6: The Great Peace, the Tokugawa Shogunate and the Caging of the Sword. With the Tokugawa Shogunate firmly established in Edo, the samurai class faced a dramatic existential shift. Their raison d'etre, warfare, was suddenly obsolete. The challenge for Shogun Ieyasu was how to maintain the dominance of the warrior class in an era where their primary skill was no longer needed. The solution was the creation of a vast, rigid, and sophisticated military bureaucracy that absorbed the samurai and transformed them from active warriors into administrators, scholars, and civil servants. The shogunate governed Japan under an iron fist, enacting a system of centralized feudalism that demanded absolute, formalized loyalty. The four-tier class system was strictly enforced. Samurai were at the top, followed by farmers, artisans, and merchants. Interclass movement was forbidden, reinforcing the samurai's hereditary right to rule, regardless of their current skills or financial health. The very identity of the samurai was woven into the social fabric as the ultimate authority. To control the powerful daimyo, Ieyasu instituted the Sankinkotai system, or alternate attendants. Under this brilliant, exhausting mandate, every daimyo was required to maintain a permanent, costly residence in Edo and spend alternating years living there, away from their domains. Furthermore, their wives and children were required to remain in Edo permanently as hostages of the shogun. This system achieved two major goals: it prevented the daimyo from consolidating wealth or launching rebellions, and it stimulated the growth of the national economy through the immense travel and upkeep expenses of these massive entourages. Imagine the procession, thousands of samurai marching along the Great Tokaido Road, accompanying their lord to Edo, a demonstration of wealth and power, but also a constant, visible reminder of the shogun's dominance. This enforced travel created a network of roads, inns, and communication links that inadvertently modernized Japan's infrastructure, a side effect of military control. It was a golden age of stability, but one built on the careful suppression of the fighting spirit. The 2.5 centuries of peace fostered an unprecedented flourishing of culture and the arts. Samurai who were no longer training for war took up the brush and the scroll. Zen aesthetics, poetry, the tea ceremony, chinoyu, and no theater became central to the cultivated samurai's life. The ideal warrior was now not just a master of the sword but a connoisseur of beauty and a scholar of Confucian ethics. This period saw the codification of Bushido into the philosophical texts we remember today, like the Hagakure. The irony was profound: the swords that had won the peace now became expensive, polished ornaments, status symbols rather than tools of slaughter. The samurai were de facto civil servants whose stipends, paid in rice, often failed to keep pace with the rising prosperity of the despised merchant class. The samurai, bred to despise profit and live by austerity, began to fall into debt, selling off their precious family artifacts to maintain their facade of honor. This financial crisis created a deep internal tension. The warrior class, the hereditary elite, was increasingly dependent on the financial class, the merchants, who were lowest in the social order but controlled the flow of money. The age of peace had begun to hollow out the warrior spirit, replacing rugged self-reliance with bureaucratic reliance, setting the stage for the system's ultimate collapse. The sword was caged, but the warrior was slowly being starved. Chapter 7: The Code of Discipline, Hagakure and the Philosophy of Death. The long peace of the Tokugawa era created an environment where the samurai ethic could be intensely scrutinized and documented, leading to the creation of arguably the most famous and severe text on Bushido, the Hagakure, or Hidden by the Leaves. Written in the early 18th century by the former samurai retainer Yamamoto Tsunetomo, it served as a defiant cry against the perceived softness and compromise of the age. The Hagakure's most famous and startling passage is its opening line: "Bushido is the way of dying." This was not a philosophy of self-preservation or measured loyalty, it was a radical dedication to instant, decisive action and the constant, unflinching acceptance of one's own mortality. Tsunetomo argued that by always living as if one were already dead, a samurai could transcend fear and execute their duty perfectly. This intense focus on death served a practical purpose in a time of peace. Since there were no longer glorious battles in which to prove one's honor, the Hagakure encouraged the samurai to maintain a constant, absolute readiness to sacrifice themselves for their lord, even in mundane circumstances. It demanded that the warrior live by an almost fanatical purity of motive, viewing every moment as potentially the last opportunity to fulfill one's duty. Imagine the psychological weight of this philosophy: every choice, every interaction, was viewed through the lens of potential, instantaneous death. This extreme stoicism was the spiritual counterweight to the bureaucratic lethargy of the Edo period. It was an attempt to keep the edge of the sword sharp, even when the sword itself was sheathed for decades. The Hagakure championed the virtues of reverence for lord and ancestors and duty. Loyalty was paramount, an absolute, unwavering commitment that superseded all personal desires, family ties, and even logic. The book is filled with cautionary tales of samurais who hesitated or failed to act decisively, painting a stark, black and white moral universe where devotion to the master was the only true measure of a man. However, the Hagakure was not universally accepted. Many intellectuals and pragmatists of the time found its fatalism and severity unrealistic for governance. It was, in many ways, an idealized, almost poetic vision of the samurai spirit, a lament for the savage purity of the Sengo Jidai warrior. It was a radical doctrine for an established government trying to maintain stability. It's hard to believe, but the code that defines the samurai in the popular imagination, a focus on immediate death and unflinching sacrifice, was largely codified during the period of their greatest political inactivity. The book remained largely a secret manuscript, circulated only within the Nabeshima clan, for over a century, a testament to its radical, potentially destabilizing nature. Yet, its enduring power lies in its unflinching articulation of the emotional core of the warrior ethos. Chapter 8: The Shadow of the Merchant, Financial Decline and Social Strain. The Tokugawa peace brought stability but created a massive economic paradox that eroded the samurai's foundation of power. The warrior class, the supreme rulers, lived on hereditary stipends paid in rice, a currency that fluctuated widely and was susceptible to crop failures and market changes. Meanwhile, the despised merchant class, placed at the bottom of the Confucian hierarchy, controlled the flow of gold, credit, and commercial goods in the rapidly growing urban centers like Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto. The samurai, forbidden by Bushido from engaging in commerce or manual labor, were structurally ill-equipped to handle the realities of a money-based economy. Their rice stipends were often mortgaged or sold to rice brokers, who were, ironically, merchants. Many samurai families fell into crushing debt, their honor-bound refusal to acknowledge their financial plight only deepening their reliance on the very class they were meant to rule. The merchant class, or shonin, grew wealthy through trade, moneylending, and the rise of a consumer culture centered around the ukiyo-e, the floating world of pleasure and entertainment. They funded the vibrant kabuki theater, commissioned sophisticated art, and enjoyed a social mobility purchased with wealth, entirely outside the strict confines of the official hierarchy. This juxtaposition created a profound societal strain: the rulers were poor, and the ruled were rich. Imagine a samurai, proudly bearing his two swords, walking through the neon-like glow of Edo's pleasure district, forced to bow to a wealthy merchant who secretly holds the deed to the samurai's ancestral land. The samurai's authority was official, but the merchant's power was real. This indignity festered, leading to sporadic, frustrated violence against merchants, but also inspiring some forward-thinking samurai to try and adapt, subtly entering into commerce under false pretenses. This financial distress had a cultural impact, too. The samurai class increasingly turned to scholarship and artistic pursuits, partly out of genuine cultural interest and partly to maintain dignity and avoid the dishonor of the market. They became the intellectual class, mastering Neo-Confucianism, but this shift further distanced them from the rough-and-tumble warrior skills that had originally justified their rule. They were administrators and scholars, but increasingly less effective soldiers. The shogunate attempted several economic reforms, including currency debasement and cancelling debts, but these measures were temporary fixes that only aggravated the underlying problem. The Tokugawa government was structurally unable to transition from a rice-based agrarian economy to a complex, commercialized one without dismantling the very hierarchy that kept the samurai in power. The samurai were essentially caught in a gilded cage. They held the ultimate social status and the right to carry swords, but the financial power, the engine of the new world, lay with their social inferiors. This profound internal contradiction was a silent, corrosive force, weakening the foundations of the shogunate from within long before any external threat arrived. The decline of the warrior's wealth signaled the coming end of the warrior's age. Chapter 9: The Black Ships, the End of Isolation and the Last War. For over 2 centuries, the Tokugawa shogunate had successfully enforced a policy of national isolation, or sakoku. Foreign influence, save for minor controlled trade with the Dutch and Chinese, was strictly prohibited. This policy was designed to prevent the destabilization caused by Christian missionaries and foreign powers witnessed during the Sengo period, and it successfully maintained the shogunate's internal control. That isolation was violently shattered on July 8, 1853, when four imposing American steam-powered warships, commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry, sailed into Edo Bay. These ships, blackened by coal and bristling with cannons, were technologically centuries ahead of anything in the Japanese arsenal. They became instantly known as the Black Ships, a sight that plunged the entire nation into panic and disbelief. Perry demanded that Japan open its ports to trade and provide protection for shipwrecked sailors. The shogun and his counselors, caught utterly off guard, were forced into an impossible choice. To refuse was to invite immediate, overwhelming military confrontation, to agree was to betray the core isolationist policy that had defined the Tokugawa peace. The forced signing of the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854 exposed the shogunate's terminal weakness. The arrival of the Black Ships triggered a massive wave of political turmoil and nationalism. The samurai class, whose very purpose was national defense, was humiliated by their government's impotence against the foreigners. This national shame fueled a powerful political movement known as Sono Joy, meaning revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. This movement was led by radical, lower-ranking samurai from the outer domains, particularly Choshu and Satsuma. These patriotic samurai realized that to expel the Westerners, Japan needed to modernize and unify under a strong, symbolic figure, the emperor, who had been a powerless figurehead for 700 years. They began to revolt against the shogunate, arguing that the bakufu had failed its ultimate duty, protecting the nation. This marked the final, decisive conflict of the samurai age, fought between the shogun's loyalist samurai and the imperialist samurai from the western domains. Imagine the last battles, samurai, fighting with their ancestral swords and spears, facing off against enemies armed with modern rifles and artillery, often supplied by the Western powers themselves. The samurai class, once the epitome of military genius, was tragically divided, with the fate of the nation resting on which faction could most quickly adopt the technology of the foreigners they sought to expel. The final conflict, the Boshin War, 1868–1869, saw the shogun's forces decisively defeated. The shogun resigned, and the young Emperor Meiji was symbolically restored to power. This event, the Meiji Restoration, marked the official end of the shogunate and, fundamentally, the end of the samurai class. The entire 700-year system of warrior rule was dismantled, not by a foreign power, but by the samurai themselves, driven by an ultimate act of loyalty to the nation over their own class. Chapter 10: The Last Samurai, Banishment and Legacy. The Meiji Restoration was a revolution from above, an elite group of reformist samurai realizing that to save Japan, they had to destroy the very class structure that defined them. The new Meiji government was determined to transform Japan into a modern, industrial, and military power capable of standing equal to the West. This required the complete abolition of the feudal class system. The dismantling was swift and brutal to the old order. In 1871, the hereditary feudal domains were abolished and replaced with prefectures. Then came the edicts that struck at the core of the samurai identity, the loss of the rice stipends, which were replaced with bonds, and most painfully, the Hito Edict of 1876, which banned carrying the sword in public. The symbol of 7 centuries of status, the warrior's soul, was ripped away. The samurai, now officially called shizoku, gentry, were just common citizens. Most samurai, though deeply resentful, reluctantly adapted. They became the intellectual and bureaucratic backbone of the new government, army, and police forces. The very skills of administration, discipline, and loyalty cultivated during the long Tokugawa peace made them perfect candidates for running the modernizing state. The irony continued, the warrior class became the architects of Japan's miraculous transformation into a modern power. However, a fierce and potent resistance emerged, led by the legendary Saigo Takamori. Saigo, a key leader in the restoration, was a traditionalist who saw the new government as betraying the true spirit of the samurai, the dedication to honor and purity over commerce and Western materialism. In 1877, he led the Satsuma Rebellion, the final, desperate revolt against the modernization policies. Imagine the final charge of the Satsuma samurai at the Battle of Shiroyama. outnumbered and outgunned by the modern, conscript army, an army trained and led by former samurai, Saigo's 400 remaining warriors charged into a hail of machine gun fire, choosing the honorable, hopeless death of the warrior code over surrender. Saigo Takamori's eventual seppuku on the battlefield is considered the spiritual and physical end of the samurai as a fighting force. The samurai, as a class, ceased to exist. Yet, the principles they championed, discipline, honor, duty, and sacrifice, were immediately transferred into the national identity. The spirit of Bushido became the philosophical foundation of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, used to inspire absolute loyalty and self-sacrifice in the 20th century. The cultural legacy permeated the arts, literature, and cinema, ensuring that the image of the stoic, selfless warrior would live on. It's hard to believe, but the same intensity and rigor that made the samurai supreme warriors are what made their descendants the leaders of modern Japan. They were a class defined by adaptability, rising from provincial guards to absolute rulers, and finally, transforming themselves into the architects of a new world. Their legacy is not just one of the sword, but of an unwavering, centuries-long commitment to a code. Closing summary. We have traced the remarkable 700-year journey of the samurai, from the dusty battlefields of the Kanto Plain to the solemn, final charge at Shiroyama. It is a saga written in blood and illuminated by flashes of profound brilliance, loyalty, and tragic honor. They were men of contradiction, simultaneously refined poets and brutal executioners, austere bureaucrats and passionate students of Zen, staunch traditionalists and the very agents of their own class destruction. The story of the samurai is a powerful, universal reflection on the nature of duty. They show us the immense psychological force of a truly committed ethical code, how Bushido could demand both a lifetime of martial discipline and the serene acceptance of instantaneous death. They remind us that the most significant transformations often come not from outside forces, but from the unbearable internal tension between preserving tradition and confronting the necessity of change. We must remember the sacrifice woven into their narrative, the personal costs of absolute loyalty, the burden of maintaining honor in an age that valued profit, and the final, wrenching choice made by the samurai leaders to voluntarily dismantle their own supremacy for the sake of the nation's future. Their history is a testament to the fact that power is transitory, but principles, whether for good or ill, are eternal. Their legacy asks us to consider, what is the code we live by today? What is the cost of our own modern loyalties? And how do we find the courage to face change, even when it demands the sacrifice of our deepest identity? The samurai, the men of the sword and the soul, offer us no easy answers, only the stark, beautiful, and undeniable truth of a life lived entirely on purpose. May their story guide us toward honor and introspection, and may the long era of their war give way to an enduring hope for peace. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you made it this far, you're the reason we keep going. Please subscribe and help us continue sharing these stories with the world.